Let's bring in our defense analyst, Oubai Shahbandar now, who joins us live from Washington. Obviously, this was coming. You knew it was coming, and the journalists there knew this was coming. Give us an idea of the mood there.
Well, we heard straight from President Trump referring to the Assad regime as the criminal regime responsible for the slaughter of innocent women and children, and calling upon Iran and Russia to no longer stand with the Assad regime. And President Trump was also very clear that he's working in concert with England and with France on these actions. What we do know is that the U.S. is using both cruise missiles and aircraft to strike sensitive Assad regime military sites, to include the Syrian Scientific Research Center, and that's very significant.
Oubai, we're watching pictures now coming in from Associated Press. These are pictures from Associated Press of the military action over, we believe, Damascus.
There are explosions over Damascus and in the Barza neighborhood of Damascus. We do know that there is a Syrian Scientific Research Center facility in Barza, which is more than likely being targeted by the U.S., British, and French aircraft as we speak. This facility is very important because it's responsible for the chemical weapon production of the regime, to include ballistic missiles and producing barrel bombs that the Assad regime uses and deploys against innocent civilians. The latest chemical weapons strike in Douma was delivered through a gas cylinder that was dropped by a military aircraft. So the fact that the Syrian Scientific Research Center is being targeted is significant. But the Assad regime has had approximately 3 days to prepare for what many view to be imminent American and coalition airstrikes against the Assad regime's military facilities. We do know that the Assad regime has moved some of its warplanes to Russian air bases and possibly Iranian air bases for safekeeping. So it's not clear how effective and sustainable these strikes by the Americans and the French and the British will be to prevent Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons again in the future. But the fact that the Syrian Scientific Research Center in Damascus, in the capital, is being targeted, I think is very significant. Whether or not the Assad regime was able to move its facilities underground or elsewhere prior to the American strikes is another question that we have to wait and see. But I think we are going to see sustained airstrikes, not only in the vicinity of the capital, but in other sensitive sites controlled by the Assad regime. And what's important to note here, lastly, is that there may be Iranian officials, Iranian Revolutionary Guard military advisors in some of these facilities. So whether or not there'd be some sort of retaliation from Iran or its Hezbollah proxy group in Syria is going to be another important next step that we're going to have to wait and watch and see how the Americans and their allies react to that.
Oubai, I should just explain, the pictures we've been watching that are just coming into us are of the jets taking off, we believe, at the RAF base in Cyprus. And I should just say that France's President Macron has issued a statement in the last few moments saying that he has ordered French military intervention in Syria in conjunction with the United States and with Britain. And perhaps a word from you on the significance of that relationship, that this isn't simply America on its own.
Indeed, as soon as the Americans cited that they had proof, what they viewed to be a strong intelligence and conclusive proof that the Assad regime was responsible for a chemical weapon strike against innocent civilians. It was determined to be a mix of some sort of nerve agent and chlorine gas. We saw subsequent statements by French and UK leadership also confirming that they had definitive proof that the Assad regime was behind this horrific chemical weapon strike against civilians. And we saw strong statements from President Macron and from Theresa May just earlier today and the day prior, backing President Trump's strong statements that the Assad regime must be held responsible by the international community for its continued use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians. We do know that the American fleet moved a massive armada in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Red Sea, a carrier strike group. I've been on one of these strike groups before. We're talking about a massive amount of firepower from cruise missiles and F-15 warplanes. that are joined by the Royal Air Force and by the French Air Force. So it's important to note here that this is a coalition that the U.S. is bringing the French and the British in a joint strike against the Assad regime. What this means is that this strike this time around against the Assad regime and its military facilities is going to be much more sustained and perhaps sweeping compared to the strikes that the Americans launched last year when the Assad regime used chemical weapons against Syrian civilians in northern Syria. This time around, it was happening in the Damascus suburbs. So the fact that the sensitive military facilities are being struck in the Damascus suburb, that's new. The fact that the Americans are launching these strikes in the heart of the capital itself is very significant, because we also know that there are Russian military advisors and Russian anti-aircraft missile systems in that area. So that could possibly lead to another level of escalation, given the Russian position firmly backing Bashar al-Assad. But it's clear here that England and France are backing the Americans in these strikes against the Assad regime, and we may be in for a long night, depending on what the regime's reaction is going to be and whether or not the Russians and the Iranians take any retaliatory measures against the Americans and the French and the British as these airstrikes continue in Damascus and in other parts of Syria.
Oubai Shahbandar in Washington.